Welcome to this tutorial in which we will be animating a robot. The series consists of two parts. The first one looking at forward kinematics and keyframe in Blender. If you've not checked that out, please do so. The link should be in the description below. This tutorial will look at inverse kinematics and its armatures and bones mainly. And this is particularly useful when you want to export it out to Unity or Unreal, but it's also very useful when you want to make complex animations like all those robots moving together and avoiding each other. But that's enough said, let's dive right in. Let's create a new collection called Armature. And let's add an armature at a random location. Just for demonstration purposes, what you want to do is go up here to add, and let me just zoom in. Click on add armature, and I'll zoom out. It has now added a single armature with a single bone. And this is also something that you can see in the hierarchy. You see that the single armature has been added together with the single bone and the pose, which is a position. What we want to do is, first of all, we want to get it in the correct location, which we'll do in a minute. And what we also want is we want to keep it a single armature, because it's the armature including the bones we can control. And we do not want a second armature because we cannot control it using a single bone. I'll show you what it means in a second if it doesn't make sense. But if I were to copy this one, and I'll press Y, you can see in the hierarchy, where I still am, I added a second armature. This is not something that I want. I want a single armature and all the bones of the different axes being part of this armature. If it makes no sense, that's not so important because I'm going to show you what it looks like. How are we going to go about this? Let me just put my cursor on armature, so everything is going to be inside of that collection. I'm selecting the object. Then I press Shift S and I say cursor to selected. I'm going to use the cursor as a marker point. So the marker point is at the correct location. I'm going to say add and I'm going to say armature. And in the hierarchy, as you can see, a single armature has been added. It's the second one, but that's not so important. And the first bone. The bone is huge. Let me just scale that down. The problem right now is that I cannot see it. It's hiding inside of the object. But I can go to the right hand side and go to Object Properties. And let me just click on it. And if I scroll down to Viewport Display, it shows an option called in front, which I'm going to tick. And if I zoom out again, you see that the bone is always visible. So at least I can see what I'm doing. Let me just scale that down a little bit. And I got my first bone in place. Now let's place the second bone. I'm going to select the second part, pressing Shift S, cursor to select it. So my marker point is already in place. I'm selecting the bone. I'm tapping into edit mode, which is important. And I say Shift D, so make a duplicate of it. And I place it anywhere I like. And now I want to move it to my marker point, which is Shift S, and say selection to cursor. And there you have it. The second bone is exactly at the pivot point of the second axis. So I can do the same thing for the third axis. Let me just do Shift S and say cursor to selected. So my pivot point is at the correct location. I'm selecting my armature. I'm tapping into edit mode and I got my bone selected and I choose this one. I can do Shift D, so make a duplicate and drag it out so I can see it. And I can say Shift S and I can say selection to cursor. And there is my third bone. This is also something you can see in the hierarchy. So I got 3 bones. I got 1 armature. I got bone 1, actually bone 0, but I call it bone 1, bone 2, and bone 3. But we'll rename them in a second. So this is going well. Let me zoom out again. And I can do the same thing here. Let me use Shift S, cursor to selected, tapping on the bones. I got my bone selected, Shift D to make a duplicate, say Shift S and say selection to cursor. And it is fine like this. I personally like to rotate this over 90 degrees so it has the same orientation as the axis. Then press minus and you see it has moved over a little bit of space. It's not in the correct location. So I'm saying Shift S again and I say selection to cursor and it's back into place. So I'm tapping out of edit mode again. I'm selecting my fifth axis, Shift S, and I say cursor to selected. So my marker point is in place. Getting back to my armature, I got my bone selected, Shift D to make a copy. And I'm going to say Shift S and say selection to cursor. The bone is huge. I'm going to scale it down and you see it's moving away from the pivot point. But that's not a big deal as I can say Shift S again and say selection to cursor and it's back into place. Tapping out of edit mode again, I'm selecting the last one, Shift S, cursor to selected. So I got my marker point in place. Tapping into the armature, say Shift D. So I got my last bone and say Shift F, selection to cursor. And I can leave it like this. And I got all my bones in position. Looking at this in the hierarchy, you can see we have a single armature and we have all the different bones here. I will rename them 1 through 6, which is easier, but I'll speed that up once I'm done with this. And you see that they're all on the same level, but I want to parent them so they follow. So when I move the bottom part, all the other bones will follow along. So let's first rename the bones. What we want to do now is parent the bones together. They're all, if I look in the hierarchy, all on the same level. They're all individual bones. Let me just zoom out. I can select the armature. I can tap into edit mode. Then I can select the child bone, in this case the second bone, and I'm selecting the parent bone, which is the mother or the father bone, what you want to call it. I can press Ctrl P and keep offset because I want to keep the bones in the same position. And there you go. And as you can see, bone number 2 is now underneath bone number 1. So that means they are parented together. And I can do the same thing for the rest of the bones. So bone number 2 and bone number 3. Actually 3 first, then 2. Ctrl P, keep offset. 4 first, 3 then. That's the parent. Ctrl P, keep offset. Then 5 and 4. Ctrl P, keep offset. And 6 and 5. Ctrl P and keep offset. And when we look in the hierarchy, you can see that all the bones are parented together, and I can make this into one bone, as you can see, and everything else is underneath, so everything is parented together. So we got everything connected, and if we want to check if everything works, we are still in object mode. We select the first bone and we rotate over the Z-axis, and everything seems to work fine. Everything follows the first bone as expected, but if I am to select the second bone, everything still moves. And this is where we need to do something a little bit different than with the other kinematics. What we need to do if we want to move the armature is we need to go all the way up here to object mode. And in this mode, we want to go to pose mode. And the pose mode is related to armatures. So you have to jump back and forth if you're working with armatures. So let me select the pose mode and zoom out again. You can see I can now select a single bone instead of the full armature. So if I now select the second bone and would rotate it over, for example, the y-axis, you see that everything follows except the first bone. And the same applies for the other one. I select a bone, I rotate over the y-axis as well, and you can see that everything moves as it should be. But again, I am in pose mode, and if I go back to object mode, This is the full armature I'm moving, so you have to swap back and forth. But what we want to do now is so we can move the armature independently in pose mode, but we need to connect the different objects, all the axes, to these bones. Let's parent the objects to the armature. I selected the first axis, first object. I'm selecting the armature, but I cannot select a single bone. To do this, I need to go up here and go to pose mode. In pose mode, I am able to select single bones just by clicking on them. And I'm just gonna click on the first one. Then I'm gonna press Ctrl P. It gives me this option to parent, and I do not want this parent to object. I want to parent to the bone. And once I've done that, and I rotate the bone over the z-axis, for example, you can see that the whole armature moves along as expected, and the first object as well. Then we can do the same thing for the next bone. So I'm tapping out of this, I'm going back to object mode. Let me select the object that I like to parent to the bone, then select the armature, go to pose mode where I can make the selection of the correct bone, which is this one. Then I say Ctrl P and I'm gonna select a bone. And right now, if I rotate this bone and I am in pose mode, you see the second object is also connected. If I were to rotate the first bone, you see that the first object and the second object move correctly. So let's do the same thing for the third bone. I need to get out of edit mode. I need to go to object mode. I'm selecting my object. I'm selecting the armature. I go to pose mode. In pose mode, I can select the bone I like. I say Ctrl P and I say bone. So that's my next one. And to do it quicker, I can select my object, I can select my armature, I can move to pose mode, I can select the bone I like, and I press Ctrl P and I have the bone. And the same procedure for the other parts. Selection of the armature, go to pose mode, select the bone you like, Ctrl P, and done that. And the last one, first go to object mode, select the object, select the armature, go to pose mode, select the bone you like, and Ctrl P and bone. Let me rotate this over the z-axis, and you see everything follows along nicely. And if I do the same thing here, I rotate over the y-axis, you see that the whole arm in front of it moves along. Everything is connected to the bone structure. We have basically achieved the same thing as with the forwards kinematics, but now we are gonna define the inverse kinematics, and that's gonna make our life a lot easier. We can now define the controlling bone, so the one bone that controls them all. I'm selecting the armature, I'm in pose mode, tapping into edit mode, and I'd say Shift D and over the x-axis. This is gonna be my controlling bone. I place it close to the last object. And what I wanna do is I want to unparent this. So I'm moving over to the right hand side. I am still in edit mode and I wanna go to the bones. So all the way at the bottom. Let me just zoom in. And as you can see, this bone is parented to bone 5. And I'm gonna delete this option. So I delete it, the black line is gone. You can also use Alt P to unparent it. So I have my controlling bone and I'm calling it the IK bone, but you can call it whatever you like. And this is gonna be the controlling bone and it's gonna be controlling this bone here. And now we're gonna add the inverse kinematics. I'm just tapping out of edit mode. I'm going to the Bone Constraints tab. Let me just zoom in here for a second. Add a bone constraint. And here is the option inverse kinematics, and it shows you the different options that are available. And if I zoom out, you immediately see there is a yellow line in the image, and I'll get to that in a second. So I got my IK bone constraint selected. I'm gonna set my target. I can choose what I like, but I want the full armature. This is what I want. And the bone controlling them all is my IK bone. You see a little bit of movement on the last bone as it moved towards the other one. It's fine for the moment. The yellow line means that I have a chain length of, well, actually everything. You can define how many bones are controlled by this controlling bone. So if I reduce the number, you can see I'm doing a few bones only, but I want the full. As you can see, they move along. You can make it 0 to control everything, or you can make it 6. If I have 6 bones, that's the same, but I'm gonna use this 0. Iterations is 500, and now let us see what's happening. I'm grabbing actually the last bone, pressing the G button, and as you can see, I can move the entire robot in a weird way, but we fix that in a second. I can also use the location over the X-axis and over the Y-axis to move it in a single direction. Like said before, I can move this robot in very weird angles, which is not supposed to happen, but we can fix that with the constraints, and we'll look at that in a second. The thing which can be of use as well is right up here, and that's the option pose, and that's the clear transform. And if you select that option, it will jump right back to the original position. As you can see, when I tap out again, in pose, you can also apply a certain position as a rest pose, and let's just do this right now. So I can move to any position that I like. If I want to get back to the original position, I can choose pose, say clear transform, and say all, and I'm back. Or I can select the location, rotation, and scale, but clear the rotation all brings me back to the default position. Okay, let's limit the rotation of these bones so they don't make these awkward movements. The first bone we're going to look at is the axis number 1. And what we basically want to achieve is we want it to rotate over this axis only, which is Z upwards. Actually, it's Z in the gizmo, but I'll show you in a second. We want the bone only to rotate over this point. So let me clear this. And the way to achieve it is you need to go to the bone step, which is located right here. And let me just zoom in for a second. And let me clear this arrow. The option inverse kinematics is going to allow us to limit the rotation of the bones. You can also limit the stiffness or set the stiffness and limit the rotation over the X, Y, and Z direction. We'll focus on the general rotation, and for the first one, it is actually the Z axis that we want to lock. Let me just zoom out. If I now go back to the model, let me just grab it to show you, and you see that the bottom part, it moves slightly, but it only moves in the correct direction. Let's do the same thing for the second axis, and at this one. And we want to limit the rotation for this axis over the Z. So that's locked as well. Let's just grab it, and I'm just going to move it down, just see what's happening. So this axis only moves in the correct rotation right now, which is the Z direction in this case. And if I look at this from the top, I can also move it in the Y direction. You see the bottom only moves over the Z axis and the second axis only over the Y axis. So those two are moving already correctly. The third bone we are gonna lock as well. And we want this to move over the Z direction only. And this one, we want this to rotate as well. And just to show you, we only want this to rotate over the y-axis. As you can see, this is what we want to achieve. Let me just put that back to 0. So axis number 4, we are gonna lock over the y-axis. And then the same goes for this one. But in this case, we want it to rotate. You see, the rotation is correct. It looks a little bit weird, but the rotation is correct. So that's the z-axis. Let's lock it in the z-axis. And the last one, that's going to be the y-axis again. And then we have limited the movement of all the bones exactly as we need it. If I just take grab of the control bone, I grab it and move it in the z direction. You see, I can move the entire robot. Take it to the top. Then grab in the y direction. As you can see, just by using this one bone, I can move the complete robot to any position that I like. So if I were to make an animation right now, and we're gonna do that, it's gonna be quite easy. So let's create an animation using the IK bone, and I'm just gonna pull the bottom side up a little. Well, I gotta grab hold of it, so there we go. And let me go to pose, clear transform and say all, so I'm back in the original position. Well, I should have selected the bone and then say clear transform and then say all. Okay, you're supposed to select the bone. I should have known that. Then we're gonna set a keyframe at our first position and we're gonna select a location, rotation and scale again. And let's just say we wanted to touch the top of the cube in 100 frames. So I'm just scrolling to the timeline. I can also change the value here, so I can say 100. That's also possible. Let me just grab this one and let me just show you. I'm gonna use the gizmo, so I'm dragging this down, so at least it's got the good height. Let me get a top view, and there you go. And let me just move it a little bit back. So this is the position that I want over 100 frames. Or 4 seconds of animation. And if I look at the animation right now, I can see it's touching the cube. If I now want to add another animation, let's say at frame 150, and let's make something nice. Let's pull it back a little and let's look it to the side. We're gonna grab a little bit forward and maybe a little bit up. We're gonna press the I button again. Location, rotation and scale, and let's do a final one over 250, and I'll grab hold of it and I'm gonna set the robot position to be okay right here, pressing the I again, 3 keyframes. As you can see, I can easily have this robot move to any position that I like, just by controlling this one bone through the inverse kinematics. The movement obviously is through the Bezier curve. So it's starting off slowly, picking up speed, slowing down again. If you want to change it, put your mouse over the timeline, click your right mouse button and choose the option interpolation mode. And here are different options that are available. So the Bezier is by default the interpolation mode, but you can change it to linear or constant along what you like for your animation. And that's quite an easy way to set up the animations, even for different type of robots. Even when they pick something up from a conveyor belt or place something, it's a setup that takes a little bit of time, but once you've done that, it's quite easy to make an animation. If you like to make the animation even more fancier than it is right now, there is an option to do so, as we have used quite a basic way to make the animation. And let me just pull this timeline up a little. If you go to the left hand side, you can change this to the graph editor. And inside the graph editor, you see all the different movements over the X, Y and Z axis for all the different bones. This you can tweak to your liking. It's not part of this tutorial. We can look at it. There are some tutorials out there which are really good, but you can make your animation as fancy as you like by using this part as well. But with the basic animations, we can get some results really quick.